Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu espero que não tenhamos nenhum problema técnico. Eu só gostaria de aproveitar, antes de começar aqui, se alguém que estiver assistindo ao vivo puder colocar um comentário só para saber se está tudo em ordem, por favor, faça isso, até porque tem um delay da nossa fala em relação ao que está ao vivo. Mas, e como eu não consigo ver aqui, se alguém puder comentar, já me ajuda a ter essa noção. Mas, enfim, gente, primeiro eu queria pedir desculpas em nome do Núcleo de Pesquisa em Relações Internacionais, aqui da Universidade de São Paulo, porque essa palestra originalmente estava marcada para as 4 da tarde. Nós tivemos alguns contratempos, inclusive se alguém aqui da cidade de São Paulo sabe que o clima não está ajudando muito. Então, inclusive, muitos preferiram ficar de forma online apenas por questões de segurança. A gente teve que passar essa palestra agora para as 4h30, teve um probleminha aqui inicial, mas por enquanto acho que agora estamos tranquilos, certo? Bom, queria em primeiro lugar... Obrigado, Camila, está tudo em ordem então. Em primeiro lugar, queria agradecer em nome do NUPRI e do professor Rafael Villa a sua presença aqui. O professor Rafael Villa, que é o diretor do NUPRI, infelizmente não pôde participar hoje. Ele foi convidado a participar de uma banca e teve que se ausentar, nem está inclusive aqui em São Paulo, mas ele pediu então para que eu pudesse fazer essa apresentação com você. Hoje nós recebemos o professor Sasikumar Sundaram, peço desculpas por qualquer pronúncia incorreta, mas o professor Sashi, ele é um querido aqui entre nós do NUPRI, porque ele fez o pós-doutorado dele aqui no NUPRI com o professor Rafael Villa, então, na verdade, nós estamos recebendo ele mais uma vez aqui no NUPRI, o que é sempre muito prazeroso poder reconectar, né, com os pesquisadores que participaram ou que passaram em algum momento pelo NUPRI. O professor Sashi, ele é Senior Lecturer de Política Externa e Segurança na Universidade de Londres. A pesquisa do professor Sashi diz respeito a políticas externas e políticas de segurança, focado em 3 casos, que é o caso da Índia, do Brasil e da China. A pesquisa do professor está muito atrelada à área de estudos de segurança crítico, onde ele investiga, né, os processos de decolonização, os processos de inteligência artificial e da construção de uma ordem internacional. Hoje, o professor apresenta para a gente uma pesquisa recente dele, que, inclusive, pelo que eu vi aqui, está para lançar um livro. Inclusive, depois, professor, se você puder tornar público maiores informações sobre o livro, onde a gente pode encontrar e quando, agradeceria muito. Mas é um livro sobre Rhetorical Powers and the International Order. Professor, de novo, mais uma vez, muito obrigado pela sua presença. Queria avisar o seguinte, gente. O professor Sachi, como vocês perceberam, fala português, ele fala muito bem português, mas ele não se sente muito confortável em dar a palestra em português, tá? O que não vai ser um problema, então ele vai falar em inglês, mas perguntas poderão ser feitas aqui pelo chat do YouTube em português ou em inglês. Fica a escolha de vocês, tá? Mas o professor fala português perfeitamente, então não é um problema. Só por uma questão de segurança, para não se sentir incomodado, ele vai falar em inglês para nós, certo? Professor, de 30 a 40 minutos, óbvio que se passar um pouquinho não tem problema nenhum. Vou aqui deixar o slide do senhor para todo mundo ver, inclusive ele do controle, mas fique à vontade, aqui ajudando em relação ao horário, mas, por gentileza, fique à vontade.
Perfeito. Ok. Perfeito. Muito obrigado, NUPRI. Eu quero agradecer ao professor Rafael Villa, eu quero agradecer ao Tiago também, um bom amigo. Muito bom, eu vou conversar em inglês, porque eu estou confortável. And I want to start this presentation by thanking everyone here, both in person as well as online. This is a project that I've been working on for some time, looking at the conditions of power politics. So the title of my today's presentation is Rhetorical Powers, Realpolitik and Brazil in International Order. And it is part of a larger project, a book project that looks not just Brazil, but also India and China. The idea really is to recover the sort of power politics that works from below in the hierarchical international system. So my presentation will be very straightforward. I will start with a broad overview of the rise of the West and how is that debate sort of portrayed in the mainstream as well as in the critical sort of discourse in international politics. And then I will look at the sort of situation in international politics as a particular form of situation in hierarchy. And thus, I'm going to elaborate the sort of problems of power for states in the lower rungs of hierarchy. And in that context, I'm going to make an argument that rhetoric is an important instrument for actors in the lower rungs of hierarchy because it is a weapon of the weak. But over a period of time, countries like India, Brazil, and China have developed a repertoire of rhetorical power politics by using rhetoric in order to engage in world politics, but also reorder the world. And I will begin this lecture after this introduction, giving some elaboration of the broader contours within which Brazilian political actors and Brazilian thinkers have formulated rhetorical ideas in international politics. But my fundamental purpose is recovering this rhetorical power politics for Brazil is important, as I will make the case, in this age of international disorder. And power politics, rhetoric, all of these ideas are broad ideas as well as really controversial in international politics because rhetoric has a bad name as well as power politics and realpolitik as well. But I will make the case and the argument that we will have to recover this way of engaging in power politics by the global south because the world is transforming at a very rapid pace where global south states will end up being once again on the far end or the losers of international system. So I will make the case of why it is important to engage in some sort of a progressive form of realpolitik because of the ongoing set of contestations on the nature of liberal international order and how countries like India and Brazil are currently categorized as swing states and how these states can play an important role in world politics. So I'll start this slide with a broad understanding of international order and disorder. Right now, we have a discourse that's going on about the rise of the West. So between 1500s and 1800, European empires overtook the Ottomans, the Chinese, and the Indians in the East. And the narrative is both the European and North American imperial formations came to dominate world politics in the course of the long 19th and until the mid-20th centuries. But today, the broad discourse is we have a tectonic shift in world politics. And this tectonic shift is captured in the phrase such as the rise of the West, the beginning of the change in world order from white Western world to a world dominated by the Chinese or by the Indians or any other sort of global South non-European actors. That is a familiar story to a large extent. But what underlies this narrative, I would argue, is that there is a fear about the rise of the global South. And this fear emanates both from the mainstream in the form of debates on the future of the liberal international order, but also from the non-mainstream. Let me give you an example from the non-mainstream version. In 2015, Immanuel Wallerstein made an important argument about how the world system is in trouble. And he was asked the question on what is the future of the so-called BRICS. Currently it is BRICS Plus, but what is the future of BRICS? And he said, and I quote, "If one's definition of anti-imperialism is reducing the power of the United States, then the BRICS certainly represents an anti-imperial force. But if we look at the relations of BRICS countries to other countries in the South, particularly in its immediate and distant neighbors, it resembles how the United States and the Old North related to them. They are sometimes accused of being sub-imperial, but they are simply imperial." In other words, what Immanuel Wallerstein was warning us is that the kind of global South politics that we are sort of facing will be a global South politics where imperialism comes back in its sort of neo versions or neo versions and so on. So the debates on liberal West versus illiberal West, the debates on democracy versus autocracy, good guys versus the bad guys, are all part of the broader debates on the fear of non-European states in the international system. And this fear has percolated down too much, as well as both among academics, but also among policymakers. So how do we make sense of this fear? And my argument, and I'm going to be very clear and brief here with three sorts of claims that I'll make in this lecture. First, I will make the argument that this sort of fear comes from the understanding of hierarchical international politics, and this hierarchical international politics has been fundamentally unequal. And the fear really is, how do we pass the baton to other non-European actors when much of our institutions in place pretty much serves the West? So in this hierarchy, I argue that countries in the lower rungs also exercise power. And it is important not just to portray these countries in the lower rungs as simply those who are in the receiving end, and sometimes as victims who've been on the suffering side for a long time. Certainly they are, and to a large extent, many of these global South states are still undergoing a lot of problems. But there are also gaps, opportunities, and areas where these states, particularly in the global South, I would say some big and ambitious global South states, have exercised power and exercised agency. So my argument is this sort of exercising agency started from the very early on periods of high imperialism, particularly in the discourse of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and here in Latin America as anti-American or anti-Yankee sort of discourse. And my third argument is recovering this sort of understanding of rhetoric in order that was deployed by political actors to articulate their own agency, their own views of international system is extremely important if we have to understand what sort of power that global South states will exercise and how that sort of power is going to be helpful for these countries to not just reorder the world, but also make the world in the way or in the images that they want to. So what is really rhetoric? And the idea of rhetoric, as I started in this lecture, is that rhetoric is commonly misunderstood. It's always seen as something which is bad, disastrous, and so on. But rhetoric largely belongs to a larger part of the language game, where it is, as speech act theorists have for a long time talked to us, that it involves particular claims and counterclaims. It involves public communication, where political actors exploit their environment to persuade multiple audiences to support their political projects. And rhetoric is narrower here than discourse. We see traditional sort of critical analysis that focuses on discourse of the liberal international order and so on. But also these days we have narratives and strategic narratives. Rhetoric is much more narrower, which allows political actors such as India, as I'll give some examples, but also Brazil and China, to actually cut across and intervene into the ongoing debate. Why so? And my argument, and this is the fundamental argument of my book as well, that there is an important problem of silencing that we witness in the hierarchical international system. And under the conditions of silencing, normal ways of exercising reason or communication is just impossible, because states, particularly the top dogs in the hierarchical international system, will end up inevitably silencing the underdogs who do not speak in the same language or same discourse like the top dogs. And thus, rhetoric is the only option for the countries in the lower rungs of hierarchy in order to be heard. And thus, it is just important not to put a particular normative view that rhetoric is terribly bad these days before we sort of examine the very importance of this instrument for countries in the lower rungs of hierarchy. So let me then go back a little bit about Brazilian sort of power politics. If rhetoric is extremely important, we have a history of important statesmen and practitioners here in Brazil who have exercised rhetoric. And I will give you a brief description of why and who were these important sort of actors and why their rhetoric, despite it being flamboyant and exaggerated in many ways, and to some extent, sometimes deeply troubling and contradictory, despite these features, their rhetoric still informs the way in which Brazil's foreign policy is conducted. And to understand that, we have to make sense of what I call the understanding of the world from an interconnected historical perspective. An interconnected historical perspective really puts into a notion that political actors, but also states, multiple sorts of institutions, organizations, bodies have always been cooperating and engaged with each other, not necessarily cooperating, but always in the sense of being connected with each other. So instead of seeing the world as sort of static entities, dependent or defined by states, or to some extent tribes and clans and so on, if we really rethink how the world is itself have been fundamentally interconnected for a very long time, and come modernity, these interconnections have only become very strong and very dense, then we see a different sort of a world. The world where the first interconnection started not with the French and the American revolutions, certainly it speeded up, but even before that, including in the 15th or the 14th centuries. But what modernity did with the advent of the French and American Revolution, it inspired people within these interconnected histories to actually get and make sense of their lives and struggles under empire. So the longer story, cut short, is that when a particular understanding of French and American revolutions have served as a narrative of progress for the West, many others who are interconnected in this sort of world have seen these revolutions as an opportunity for them to be heard, an opportunity to recreate similar revolutions in their own world. We saw that, for example, in Haiti against France in 1804. We saw that with Mexican revolutions against Spanish controls. And similarly, in parts of India, Nepal had its sort of very fierce resistance against the East India Company, Burma as well, and the so-called India's Great Grand Rebellion, or the first mutiny against the English in 1857. We also have examples of Maori kings who declared the boundaries of the kingdom in 1858, standing against the sort of British, using the same narrative as the Age of Revolution. Recently, many modern historians, including historians of global history, such as Sujit Sundaram and others, have pointed out the importance of bringing these sort of interconnected histories back. And based on the notions of Chris Bailey, if we bring these interconnected histories back, what we see is European empires were largely garrison states, meaning where military security played an important role or a top priority to finance their wars and consolidate their military and aristocratic character of their conquests. And we saw that example here in Latin America, where the British Empire, after the Napoleonic invasion of Portugal in 1807, helped the Braganza monarchy escape Portugal to Brazil in 1808. What it led to in a couple of weeks is that Brazil changed from a colony from 1500 to 1808 to a metropole from 1808 to 1821, and later on to an empire from 1822 to 1888. In other words, from an interconnected historical sort of point of view, what we see is that there is a sort of a connection between empires in order to safeguard their sort of garrison states or their mentalities of safeguarding their aristocratic character of conquest. But at the same time, there were revolts and revolutions. And in Brazil, the big examples there are several examples of revolts, revolutions, and resistance within Brazil. But to give some few examples, Brazil's radical priests, Frei Caneca and Manuel Carvalho Paes de Andrade, engaged in an anti-Portuguese revolt in Pernambuco in 1824. They challenged the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro I, who after independence in 1822 aspired a colonial reunion of Brazil with Portugal. It is a rhetorical enterprise, I would argue. So was Brazil's José Bonifácio Andrade e Silva, who was a close advisor to Dom Pedro I, who advocated a rhetorical idea of building a homogeneous nation in the course of few generations. This rhetorical force also had material implications where there were several members from the indigenous tribes, as well as people from the Black community and slaves were killed in order to develop a homogeneous notion of Brazil. But still, it had a force, it had a way in order to articulate the notion of the state or the Brazilian state. And this is where the statecraft comes in, where it is very much embedded with rhetoric. After the US Civil War in 1861 and 65, the problem of what to do with the enslaved Brazilians became an important problem for Brazilian state. Brazil's imperial statecraft worked to stop its subjugated people, that is the blacks, from taking any inspiration from the US Civil War. Why wouldn't they? Because in an interconnected world, they do see the ideas moving very fast, and some had actually seen inspirations from the US Civil War in order to seek sort of independence, justice, and rights and liberty. But as the governor of the maritime province of Maranhão reported, the slaves in the country of Anatatuba in 1861 did not have, and I quote, organized plan and only hope for their freedom. But I will do whatever I can to neutralize any plans that the matter concerning the United States of America might create here among the slaves. As the US Civil War sort of became an important topic of conversation, not just among members of the state, but also among the enslaved people here in Brazil, the idea was transmitted rhetorically. And for state building project, because state has much more power than those people who are engaged in resistance, the rhetorical project of the state took a much more powerful way of communicating the idea of statecraft and building a notion of a Brazilian state. This is not very unique to Brazil. If you take the interconnected history into account, in 1832 already, India's reformer Ram Mohan Roy played an important notion or challenged the important notion of terra nullius and played an important role in asking the British East India Company to stop justifying their rule based on the notion of terra nullius. His contemporary Ram Ras looked back to Kautilya's Arthashastra on ancient Indian treaties on statecraft to suggest a long lineage of India's sort of statecraft. Later on, with the slogans of Bande Mataram or Hail to Motherland in 1875, already started using these sort of rhetorical slogans. To cut things short, I believe what Christopher Bailey mentions is exactly correct. Christopher Bailey puts this point saying that the need for self-strengthening spread across all extra-European civilizations. Subjects or partially independent subjects had these sort of views about self-strengthening projects. And at the same time, when European dominance reached its high point after 1850, these sort of self-strengthening projects also came into view. And thus, what we see is the constant sort of intermingling of ideas into this interconnected world, where rhetoric was used both by folks who wanted to resist the empire, but also those state builders. The notion of state builders using rhetoric became extremely strong during the age of new imperialism. And we all know the sort of standard story of new imperialism, where it was based on, from the period of late 19th century onwards, the principle was based on social Darwinistic ideas, the idea of the survival of the fittest. By the mid-1860s already, Britain had moved away from protectionism and aggressively supported free trade, offered public goods, and celebrated geopolitical projects based on the notion of Greater Britain. Bismarck similarly demanded protection for iron and rye. Central European states established their tariff walls, including the United States. But the story that is not really well known is that by 1880s already, there were heterogeneous Pan-Asian, Pan-African, and Pan-Islamic movements. And here in Latin America, there was also Pan-American movements that pushed back against the geopolitical principles of the empire. In India, the pushback came from important practitioners and thinkers such as Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra, who famously argued that the British drain of wealth is not really helping India, but it is actually draining the wealth in order to support the empire. But what we also see is that because of the different consolidation of state in the case of Brazil, Brazil's geopolitical project took a much stronger, solid sort of articulation than sort of dependent colonies like India. In Brazil, the famous example is of Barão Rio Branco. And I would argue Barão Rio Branco is the first geopolitical thinker who used the interconnected ideas from the sort of interconnected world and used it in order to build a strong state. And his idea was based on the legal principle of uti possidetis. And it is a rhetorical idea. Rio Branco, to some extent, used the power of rhetoric about Brazilian state and settled the boundary problems, adding territory to Brazil that is equivalent to France and Germany, and setting the stage for an aggressive nation building. And I'm not saying this lightly, because as Rio Branco himself put it, and I quote, Brazil resolutely entered the sphere of great international friendships to which it is entitled through the aspiration of its culture, through the prestige of its territorial greatness, and the strength of its population. Recent historical research on the sort of advent of geopolitics of Rio Branco has highlighted the problems of white civilizational narrative that has been going on in Brazil for a very long time. Nevertheless, the notion of rhetoric that underwrites Brazil's state-building project as one particular version of Brazil standing up to its rights, notions of liberty, notions of protecting its own culture, although albeit a sort of a selective understanding of what that culture is, but also articulating ideas of territorial greatness, came very early on for Brazilian states, in Brazilian statecraft. And that led later on, and we know this history, at least with big diplomatic protests of Brazilian political actors such as Rui Barbosa in The Hague. And the whole notion of understanding the importance of rhetoric is that Barbosa was considered verbosa in The Hague for talking too much about rights and importance of justice. But why wouldn't he? Because if he were not talking about the rights and justices and the importance of Latin American equality, no one else would. And thus, the problem for Rui Barbosa was not also articulating the importance of Brazil's position in Latin America, but also rhetorically articulating the ideas of justice, equality, and the ability to be known and heard in a system where it was fundamentally unequal. But it was not just Rui Barbosa. In 1905, we know the examples of Joaquim Nabuco, an anti-slavery stalwart, an aristocrat. He was appointed as the ambassador of the first Brazilian embassy in Washington, D.C. He brought the traditional debates on the importance of Monroe Doctrine in Brazil and shifted his erstwhile anti-Americanism to become what he would call an emphatic Americanist. These are rhetorical ideas. In other words, people who wanted to defend a particular policy have to make their policies really heard, and thus they simplify it in their rhetoric, that I am anti-American, I am pro-American, I am pro-Monroe Doctrine, I'm anti-Monroe Doctrine, and so on. But these rhetorical claims take a life of their own. And Rui Barbosa was twice an official candidate for the presidency of Republic and the head of the Brazilian delegation to the Second International Peace Conference at The Hague, who firmly believed that Brazil's foreign policy was severely outdated. And this sort of claim that some foreign policy is severely outdated, again, is a rhetorical claim in order to articulate a novel view of how to reorder both Brazil, but also the international system. And as the sociologist here in USP, has Angela Alonso put it, the rhetoric of Rui Barbosa, and I quote, was that of equality of all nations. But his group of supporters were the delegates from Latin America, not the United States. In that sense, Brazilian stance ultimately appeared to be closer to Latin Americanism, close quote. Although Nabuco focused on, I quote, Professor Angela Alonso here, realpolitik, because equality might be good as a principle, as Nabuco believed, and argued that we cannot impose equality on the world since economic and military inequality between countries was a fact. What really these debates show is that Brazil was very much part of not just the international system, but the hierarchical international system. And Brazil was very much aware of the impending problematic economic and military inequality. And Brazilian political actors not just recognized the problems of American empire, American tentacles in Latin America, but also used rhetoric in order to defend the state. And it is a state-building project, and all state-building projects are exclusionary. And I'm aware that these sort of exclusionary policies come at a very high cost for indigenous people, for people from African enslaved communities, for people who were not even recognized as humans in the first place, such as in India, from the lower caste members. But what rhetoric does is that it gives voice to people in the lower rungs when others also use and appropriate same sort of tools in order to be heard. The example is rhetoric coming back in the League of Nations. So when we have rhetoric in the League of Nations of Afrânio de Melo Franco, who talked about his immediate task was in opposing Argentina and Mexico. Brazil could be considered as the spokesman of the Pan-American conscience at the international level. We see that similar discourse came back in the Cold War period. We saw during the League of Nations time that members of the geopolitical thinkers such as Everardo Barroso or Alberto Torres, who's the father of Brazilian nationalism, called for an awakening and the transformation of the national character of Brazil. It was a rhetorical idea, an exclusionary idea. And Everardo Barroso was very racist in many of his ways to talk about equipotencia and so on. But it came back again during the period of the military dictatorship, during the Cold War period. Oswaldo Aranha and Raul Fernandez rhetorically used the tensions between the United States and Spanish American republics to advance Brazil's interest through mediation. In 1935, Oswaldo Aranha wrote to Vargas that the Indo-Spanish countries are natural enemies. They cannot inspire confidence, and even today, they retain suspicion towards us, inherited from the Iberian struggles and heightened by continental rivalries. This sort of rhetoric did not go away. It came back during the Cold War period, much more intensively in the period of the military dictatorship. But rhetoric was also important for other Cold Warriors, particularly those who challenged the superpowers. And one of the most important players here is JK. He exemplifies these sort of rhetorical innovations. When Kubitschek talked about the importance of development, it was a rhetorical idea. In fact, he was one of the fantastic orators. And he reminded Richard Nixon that liberty is merely a word for those who live in extreme poverty. And thus, I quote, he says, consistent governmental effort, including American governmental aid in infrastructures, is necessary. He argued for an Operation Panamericano for economic development. But the most important rhetorical component of JK was his claim that we wish to be part of the West, but we do not want to constitute its proletariat. In other words, the notion of being heard in the system involves some sort of a simplification of world politics, some sort of putting it in some package in order to be heard. As foreign minister in 1961, Santiago Dantas, he called for politica externa independente, or autonomous foreign policy, showing that the state was willing to stand up to the pressures of US dominance. Even though the earlier ideas of geopoliticians, such as Everardo Barroso, Mario Travassos, and others, came back with vengeance among the during the period of dictatorship, in the 1970s, the big debates on autonomy was also a rhetorical idea that looked back to the rhetoric of independent foreign policy. In fact, Foreign Minister Antonio Azevedo Silveira highlighted economic growth to assert that Brazil is even more able to participate in the affairs of the world as a power with its own sort of political weight, thanks to its success of national development. Today, Brazil is increasingly able to assert its presence in the world and within the West. I call this rhetorical idea precisely because much of these foreign policy actors and practitioners are aware of the fundamental problems in their state, fundamental problems of inequality, economic problems, problems of development, problems relating to sanitation and basic care. But countries, practitioners from India and China use the rhetorical device in order to be heard because that is the only way for them to build a strong state. And they failed in many ways, and they also succeeded in others. And perhaps recovering this sort of rhetorical force that has been part of Brazil's understanding of international politics for a very long time, at least from Rio Branco, is, I would argue, an important component in order to rethink Brazil's position in the international system currently. Why so? I argue that the rules-based international order is fundamentally imperial, and to a large extent, many of the debates about the West versus the rest, liberalism versus illiberalism, whether you're for us in terms of supporting the future of democracy, or against us by aligning with China, are all sort of questions which are very much part of the hierarchical international system that the West demands the West in order to comply. And under these conditions, it is simply not possible for global South states to talk about their principled positions in international politics, because content really gets reduced or sacrificed at the altar of power politics. And thus, I argue that it is important for states such as India, Brazil, and China, including other global South states, to recognize that it is just not enough to become Gandhian in many sense to speak truth to power, but do power in the sort of ways that revolutionize the world, like what Gandhi did. So Brazil must return to realpolitik in this age of disorder. But why so? And I have three reasons to say why Brazil must return to its rhetorical power politics modality. And I'll explain in the end on what sort of new innovations that Brazilian policymakers can do in order to not repeat some of the mistakes that were made in the past. One is that the liberal international order is fundamentally hypocritical. The notions of liberal rules apply to some, but not others. International law is applicable to some states, but not others. International order, based on the notions of institutions such as the World Trade Organization, is now being abandoned by the United States because of the entry of China and asking sort of important questions on how agricultural products and other sorts of litigations can be carried out. And it will not be a big surprise if the United States also abandons other global institutions in the future in the name of protecting national security. So if hypocrisy is the fundamental way in which the world works, and I reckon if that is the reality or the fact of international politics, then rhetoric of underdogs must also become the fact. Because within hypocrisy, it is just not possible to speak truth. It is important to engage in effective performances. It is important to engage in emotional performances that is pragmatic in many ways in order to be heard. And we are in an age of what is called weaponized interdependence. Much of the world today is very tightly interconnected because of the past period of globalization. But we are also in the phase of deglobalization, where there are important doubts within countries like India, Brazil, and China, but also in the West about the benefits of globalization being fundamentally unequal, helping some members but not others. But this interdependence has become a reality. And since interdependence has become a reality, those countries that benefited from this interdependence continue to maintain their superior positions in the hierarchical system. Take the case of the United States. This is the US Navy forward deployed bases by the United States in order to deter sort of China. And this is the number of private military companies in work, and much of these companies, as you can see, belong to the West. So even if there is a period of what some might call deglobalization, there is a continued sort of position among the Western states to retain their power, not to dilute it. So all the debates about the decline of the West or the decline of the power of the United States are simply impossible, at least I would argue, because there is a continuous improvement of the US power, not a decline. And thus, increased US power will create more chaos and more problems to the global South than otherwise. And where do we see this sort of manifestation of this important power of the United States? In military spending. In terms of global military capabilities, as you can see, the United States has more than sort of like the share of several other countries in this world. And this share of 37% is going to be the same. It is going to be retained. It is going to be improved over a period of time. And other countries that are racing ahead are seen as simply inadequate in order to manage the tremendous amount of military power potential that the United States is able to bring. If you look at the sort of examples of the US defense outlay, the projection itself is not in decline at all. So the notions of the American decline does not take into account of its sort of continued increase in the spending for the military. And if you square up the military spending in 2023 alone, the United States and other NATO members categorized as the West, within quotes, are in the first two positions. So any other sort of global South states really trying to outcompete the West might just become a pipe dream, because if that is what they want, in many ways, that is what they get, because the earlier the war in terms of power transition, the better to maintain the hierarchical international system. And thus, narratives about the rise of China and the spectacle of the rise of China is all a way to sort of justify the notions of the continued ways of weaponizing interdependence. And this is the other example in the Financial Times of the undersea cable that was put, and that those are undersea cable that run our internet, right? And it is all tightly connected. And a successful 2-year campaign by the US officials culminated in the consortium planning for a CME-V6 cable, awarding the contract to US suppliers Subcom after initially selecting HMN Tech. And the Chinese, on the other side, are building their own sort of tech and undersea cable, calling it as a rival peace cable along the similar routes. What we have here is, again, a sort of weaponization of these sort of sea cables. And in terms of the debates on weaponized interdependence, what we have is an idea of the countries in the global South, particularly those countries that are using these networks for development, for economic progress, for including education and so on, are vulnerable in order for, if they don't buy in the sort of principles, then they might be in the choke point of cutting down access to these sort of networks. And that is a fundamental reality for many of these states, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America. The chances of the United States cutting down its supply or access to many of its sort of underground cables, or its access to important information about intelligence and crime networks, cannot be taken for granted. Because one day, if Brazil is not ready to support the American policies towards China, the United States will not hesitate to cut down these supplies, cut down the choke or increase the choke points in order to let the United States, in order to let the Brazilian policymakers accept the policies of the United States. But this is the traditional realpolitik of all empires. Why would the United States be any different? Because if the United States wants to maintain its sort of superior position, justified in the names of rules-based international order, then any form of controlling choke points through which global South relies is a particular way to arm twist other states to submission. Under these conditions, what options do states in the global South have other than rhetoric? Because it is just impossible for any of these global South states to plan a military alliance in order to upend the international order. Forget about using these military alliances to wage a war. In these sort of current hierarchical dynamics, for states in the global South, there are no other sort of power political option other than being part of the international system, where rhetoric becomes the most important device for them to make themselves heard. This is the spectacle of the China threat theory. The number of exports that Brazilian companies depend on in order to survive, in order to export to China, is increasing day by day. And so are the threats that one day the Brazilian political actors, but also business entrepreneurs, might have to cut down their exports to China. They might have to find alternative supplies to either Africa or India. And in the same way, there is a competition between India and China. And the sort of liberal international order rests on the notion that in this competition between India and China, the Indian policymakers will forever sort of like tilt, even if there is no sort of formal alliance because of India's history with non-alignment, it'll tilt towards the West in order to balance China. But what the spectacle of the China threat theory does not say is that the continuous ongoing form of dependency of the global South states on the discourse about the future of international order, resting on the sort of debates on how the United States or China can manage the future, or what is the future of autocratic states versus democratic states, and so on. And if the continued spectacle of China threat Russia threat, Iran threat, and the continued ways of ongoing wars would be the fundamental reality of international politics, there is no way other than rhetoric to speak truth to power. It is very important when the international system relies on continued sort of discourse that keeps reproducing the same problem. There is no other way other than rhetoric in order to be heard. And thus, I make an argument that, and I'll make three concluding remarks here. The first remark is Brazil cannot choose between the liberal West and illiberal axis. So does India or any other global South states. Brazil has to play power politics within the sort of ongoing dynamics in the international system. Brazil has to, in other words, play the role of an intermediary or a broker. And this is very different from the erstwhile Brazilian ambition to be the peaceful mediator of disputes. I believe that old sort of discourse about Brazilian autonomy and the ability of Brazil to be the most peaceful negotiator or mediator is gone. In the new world of international disorder, Brazil must play the role of a broker or a swing state where Brazil's rhetoric not only enables other states to make or take attention to Brazil's position in the Latin American as well as in the world order region, but also to listen to some of the big problems that are created in the liberal international system. The second argument that I want to make is that within liberal international order, there is a general recognition that countries like India and Brazil that are democracies will function as swing states. And if the notion of swing states gets a lot of traction in the United States, but also in the West, then it is important for countries like India and Brazil to play the role of a swing state as realpolitik, not as somebody who would be very understanding of making things managed in a peaceful sort of way, but also making it rhetorical to ensure that the world is multipolar and the powerful states try to behave in a particular way, respecting the rules and regulations of the institutions within which that was signed up for managing the world. If the swing states would not do it, no other states would do, because the legitimacy of states like Russia or China, or including Iran or any other countries to criticize the liberal international order is understandable, but rejected. Because they will fundamentally criticize the liberal international order, they are fundamentally illiberal. That would be the argument, and that would be the story. Countries like India and Brazil must take an important role in order to critique the international system, in order to discipline states like the United States and the West, in order to focus or enable them to focus on the larger problems of the international system, such as climate change on the one hand, or problems of decolonizing artificial intelligence on the other. If we don't have this sort of disciplining way of managing the multipolar order, and if we return to the notions of debating whether the liberal order is really liberal or whether the rules-based or international order can be sustained and so on, we will lose, I would argue, the important role of states like India and Brazil. And the final point, which I want to make, is to have a word of caution. Rhetoric is dangerous and it requires statesmanship. And to a large extent, important leaders who wielded rhetoric in the past, like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi currently in India, are not really playing the realpolitik game. And the real game of realpolitics is not just be loud, but engage in rhetoric. And there is a difference between demagoguery and rhetoric. And to be a real politician who could manage the international order, we need to have more players who could wield the power of rhetoric rather than engage in demagoguery and then give up the world in a particular sort of way that is run by the West. The line between rhetoric and demagoguery is very thin, and that is why we need principled leaders who have a vision about how the world should work in the future. And if this vision is seen as one thing that can be fought for, that can be defended, then we need political actors from Brazil and from India to defend the international order. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Sashi. Só o modo que eu vou pôr a gente aqui maior. Sashi, seguinte, como geralmente tem um delay, as perguntas vão chegando. Acabou de chegar uma, então vou até aproveitar para colocar, porque eu também tenho minhas perguntas, que eu fiquei anotando aqui algumas coisas, mas como já tem pergunta da quem está assistindo, já vamos colocar.
Okay.
Então, está perguntando o Thiago sobre se o atual governo brasileiro se posiciona num papel pragmático, né, entre esses atores. Você quer responder individualmente? Ou você prefere que a gente junte algumas perguntas e você responde tudo de uma vez?
Individualmente, primeiro, e depois vamos ver quantas perguntas tem, e depois...
Então, por favor, pode responder o Thiago Lima, e depois faço minhas perguntas também.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for this really good question, which is asking, are the current government positioning itself in this pragmatic role among these actors? And this is extremely important and a very good question. And I think the current sort of government is getting pragmatic in many ways. The old notions of trying to defend a particular idea of a leftist liberal international order that requires some sort of a fundamental overthrow of the international system is abandoned in many ways for reasons of domestic politics here in Brazil, but also for reasons of understanding that the world itself is fundamentally transformed. So yes, the current government is positioning itself in this pragmatic role, and thus we would want to see more and more of these rhetorical interventions in international politics. However, and this lies the problem, the more rhetorical interventions are made by Brazilian political actors or anybody in the South, they will be under greater attention. They'll be put under a microscope in order to behave. And this power politics is something that Brazilian political actors must be okay to deal with, and not just say something and then give up on that idea. Let me give you an example. The biggest important idea, or one of the biggest important ideas in recent years, was the idea of responsibility while protecting. It was a very powerful rhetorical idea, and after that it was given up. It was given up precisely because once that idea was made public, it was put under a microscope. It was debated. It was asked by many Western actors to behave, or to ask Brazilian political actors to just toe the line, and they gave up. So the important idea of being pragmatic in this rhetorical device is to continuously keep doing it, despite the sorts of challenges and microscopic sort of attention that it could get, because the idea of rhetoric is not just to only influence Western policymakers, but also a sort of an observant global public who might not always be neutral. And that is very important to sort of keep the conversations going. Have I answered your question, Thiago?
Bom, enquanto ele responde aí, eu queria fazer algumas questões para você. Na verdade, sabe, primeiro eu queria te parabenizar, porque de fato a sua discussão traz elementos que são extremamente importantes para a gente pensar nos dias de hoje. Inclusive essa discussão sobre ordem internacional, sobre qual configuração de poder estamos presenciando, é um debate que anda muito em alta no nosso campo. Tem algumas questões que eu anotei aqui, Sachi, mas aí também foi porque você foi me suscitando essas ideias, eu queria ouvir um pouco de você. Primeiro, uma questão muito conceitual, que eu queria ouvir um pouco mais de você sobre a ideia de hierarquia. Por quê? Primeiro que eu concordo perfeitamente, acho que a gente precisaria, de fato, abandonar muito grande parte da tradição teórica das relações internacionais, que vai partir do pressuposto da anarquia, né? E adotar um pressuposto contrário me é sempre muito proveitoso. Mas também a gente vê uma certa disputa de sentido sobre o que significa hierarquia. Se a gente pensar no caso brasileiro, temos a teoria da dependência dos anos 60, que já dizia sobre hierarquia, mas a gente tem alguns desenvolvimentos posteriores que vão ter certas diferenças conceituais. O próprio Nicolas Onuffi, ele apresenta uma certa distinção, às vezes ele até associa muito mais ao modelo feudal, em analogia ao que era o modelo feudal, e aí eu queria entender um pouco como você, então, está, a partir desse debate sobre hierarquia, como você sai dele, né? Como é que você, o que você captura dele. Uma coisa que eu achei muito interessante é essa sua afirmação de que devido a essa desigualdade de poder entre os países do sul global, eles teriam que lidar muito mais com elementos ideacionais do poder do que elementos materiais de poder, certo? E aí você usa a questão da retórica o poder da retórica enquanto um elemento ideacional do poder. E aí, porque aí a ideia de que, né, com o poder material você impõe, e quando na ausência do poder material você precisa da retórica, do convencimento. E aí a minha questão até tem a ver com isso que você falou no final, sobre, né, uma coisa é usar retórica, outra coisa é fazer demagogia. Então, no fundo, a ideia é o poder retórico se transformar num poder normativo, e aí o papel da Realpolitik seria, então, de fato, chegar ao poder normativo. O que me leva a uma outra questão, porque aí eu não sei se eu entendi errado, mas você associou muito a ideia do poder ideacional, poder da retórica, enquanto uma ferramenta típica dos países do Sul pela desigualdade do poder. Mas, por exemplo, e os países do Norte? Não se utilizam também de elementos ideacionais? E aí, esse elemento ideacional dos países do Norte seriam elementos não retóricos ou também poderiam ser caracterizados enquanto elementos retóricos? E uma última pergunta mais empírica. Eu sei que não é o seu estudo de caso o BRICS, embora você vai flertar com a ideia de BRICS por causa do Brasil, da China e da Índia, mas eu queria saber a questão da Rússia em relação a isso. Até porque me parece que aqui no Brasil fica um pouco estranho certas discussões sobre o Sul global, quando a gente discute a China e a Índia, e a China e a Rússia, perdão. Porque vão ser dois países que a gente tem que pegar os elementos materiais mais clássicos, poder militar e economia, são países que estão muito alto no ranking de cada uma dessas categorias. Então, eu não sei, aí eu queria saber da sua própria pesquisa se você vê alguma diferença muito crucial entre o Brasil e a Índia de um lado e a China do outro, que demonstraria, né, o impacto dessa diferença do poder material que a China tem em contraposição ao Brasil e à Índia. Mas é isso, eu vi que o Daniel também colocou uma pergunta aqui, mas se você quiser responde essa, depois a gente vê aqui com o Daniel.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so muito obrigado pelas perguntas. Thank you very much. I'll try to answer it in English because that is much more easy. So there are three sort of questions you're asking. One is a conceptual theoretical question on the meaning of hierarchy. And the second is the question on the power of rhetoric to change the normative order. And is sort of rhetoric in the global north functions in the similar way as the rhetoric of the global south? And the last is the empirical question on the focus of Russia. So first, on the sort of question on the theory of hierarchy. And as you mentioned it, one of the biggest debating point in international relations is the question of anarchy for a very long time. But if we take realism seriously, they often focus on the military hierarchy of states. So hierarchy is part of the realist discourse within the sort of like anarchical understanding of international politics. But the sort of hierarchy that I am interested in is much more social sort of hierarchy, not necessarily based on the distinction between whether some have more tanks and guns rather than others. It is much more on the questions of race, class, caste, and sort of important distinctions that come in organizing the world as civilized versus barbarians, somebody who is with us in terms of progressive and scientific and modern versus those who are not. And most of the time, the debate is whether you are with us in the West and whether you are not. And these are hierarchical questions. In other words, the social hierarchy, to some extent, covers and overlays on the material hierarchy. It is impossible to talk about sort of questions on material hierarchy like realists do without taking into account the social hierarchy within which certain ideas are framed in the first place. Whether nuclear weapons in the hands of, as Alexander Wen points out very early on, in the hands of North Korea, is it a friend or an enemy makes a completely different, big difference in the way sort of the treatment of nuclear weapons itself is seen in the international system. If nuclear weapons by itself is bad, then anybody possessing it should be bad. And so was the commitment of the NPT to engage in nuclear disarmament. But nuclear weapons in the hands of North Korea is bad, not in the hands of Europe or in France. And that is because, not just because of the friend-enemy distinction, as Wen points out, but also the deeper sort of social hierarchy within which states are placed in the international system. And that is where I would see the concept of hierarchy, on the importance of concept of hierarchy. And one of the other interesting concepts here is the concept of heterarchy. where the notion of not just anarchy and hierarchy, but the concept of heterarchy, where there are multiple sorts of hierarchical relationship within an anarchical setting. So within the larger sort of hierarchical position, there might be pockets of anarchy, and within those pockets of anarchy, there might be completely different sorts of equation. And I think that is a very interesting sort of theoretical intervention. The second question that you're asking is extremely relevant. I was only selectively focusing on the rhetorical power of the global south. In fact, rhetoric is an instrument for every political actor, for every politician. It is a weapon for Donald Trump, as it is a weapon for somebody in the global south. It was a weapon for Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, as it was a weapon for Indira Gandhi. But the purpose for which these rhetorical tools are wielded is fundamentally different. For the global north, or in the hierarchy, the top dogs, the purpose of them using rhetoric is to preserve order, is to maintain order. But for members in the global south, or particularly those in the lower rungs of the hierarchy, the purpose of them wielding rhetoric is to articulate notions of disorder, articulating the notions of problems of order. What is seen from the top down as order is often disorder for many of these states. So rhetoric is the same, but the purpose for which it is wielded is completely different. Preservation of order on the one hand, and challenges to the problems of order, or articulating the problems of disorder on the other. And I am also part of a cluster or a center where we study disorder. So it's the Center for Disorder Studies. And the idea behind that study is to bring in more and more conversations on what is it about liberal international order that is not really orderly. So like the famous Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor empire, liberal international order was neither liberal nor international and not really orderly in that sense. And the last empirical question on the notions of traditional power that Russia and China wields versus India and Brazil, which might not have those traditional power potential, which is true. And I think that is a very important problem, particularly in the changing dynamics of the international system. But as we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even states that has traditional instruments of power, like Russia, which has nuclear weapons, which has military potential and so on, can be subjected to sanctions within the weaponized interdependent way of looking at globalization, can be completely shut down from the world, can be asked to not have any more conversations on the future of international order because they've been stigmatized as those that do not belong to the West anymore. So even countries like China and Russia, even if they have traditional instruments of power, they don't have the social recognition. In other words, they are frequently misrecognized in the international system because there is a commitment towards sort of articulating notions of the liberal international order, as these countries sort of are the biggest violators of liberal order. If we take the normative judgments aside, yes, it is true that countries like Russia and China are violating liberal international order. So are other countries which are the defenders of the liberal order. Some of the biggest challenges of the liberal international order are by the liberals themselves. In order to make the world a better place, they would not be sort of like hesitant to disrupt the world. And the justifications to continue the sort of like stigmatization of Russia and China is to perpetuate a particular military industrial complex in the United States. And that is why I showed the slide of the big arms exporters in many ways. So it is not a power, it's not a project. The liberal international order is not a project that is devoid of power. In fact, liberal international order is a much more power politic way of looking at the world than realism in many ways. And thus, to articulate a multipolar order through rhetoric is to actually discipline the liberals. And that is how I would see it.
Perfeito. Obrigado, Sérgio. Daniel tem uma pergunta aqui. Se é possível manter uma retórica de realpolitik sem se chocar com o intervencionismo norte-americano?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's a fascinating question. Is it possible to have a rhetorical realpolitics without the challenge or without the shock of American interventionism? And I think this is a serious problem in many ways because there is always a question of American interventionism hanging in the background of every state in international politics. And this is just not a theoretical possibility. It is, in fact, a real possibility if the Republicans come to power, or even if the Democrats come to power, the notion that sometimes we have to intervene in another country in order to make the world a better place. So is it possible to have a rhetoric without that interventionism? I think so. In order to stop that interventionism, rhetoric should come first. To discipline the United States, it is just not impossible to fight them. It is just not possible to fight them with military force. It is again not possible to fight them through non-violence like what Gandhi did. And to stop interventionism, to stop the sort of American power going and meddling or using its tentacles around the world, the best sort of way is to foreground it with rhetoric, is to mobilize a global sort of view in order to stop the sort of American sort of like interventionism. However, and I'm very much aware that this is just not possible sometimes, because even despite the rhetorical force, the United States, if it is supported by a large segment of American supporters, both in the domestic public as well as in the international level, decide to intervene, they will intervene. And that is a fundamental problem of American power. And we have to reconcile to that fact that somehow, not just now, but also in the future, we have a grand coalition of different forces moving together in the United States, particularly with the veering of the far right and white supremacy groups who might not be sort of hesitant to engage in interventionism as others were in the past. So we will see more and more of both sort of ideological justifications for interventionism, but also the notions of American power expanding itself in many other parts of the world. And the only solution I see is rhetoric, because there's no way to fight the American military unless there is a collective action by many other states in the international system. And rhetoric is the only way to mobilize this collective action to discipline the Western sort of ways of looking at the world.
Perfeito. Sasha, não acho que temos mais perguntas, tem um agradecimento aqui da Camila pela sua apresentação. Eu vou até aproveitar o gancho dela. Se você puder passar para a gente algumas informações do livro que faz parte da pesquisa, para a gente ficar na espera do lançamento dele.
Obrigado. Vou entrar em contato com vocês mais uma vez quando o livro está em processo para terminar. O título é Rhetorical Power mesmo. Então, a gente vai conversar mais. Então, vamos conversar não somente o Brasil, mas com Índia e China também, sobre order international.
Perfeito. Então, assim que você tiver maior informação, passa para a gente, que a gente divulga aqui para o pessoal.
Sim.
Bom, Sasha, muito obrigado mais uma vez em nome do Núcleo, do professor Rafael. Agradeço a sua presença aqui, a exposição da sua pergunta. Foi muito proveitoso poder ouvi-lo e ver o caminho que sua pesquisa ainda tem.
Okay. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Também agradeço quem estiver assistindo a gente. Muito obrigado pela presença. Sabemos que sexta-feira, final da tarde, nem sempre é muito convidativo, mas agradeço imensamente. Então, uma boa tarde a todas e todos. E fiquem de olho nas redes sociais do Núcleo, que a gente avisa sobre tanto o lançamento do livro quanto os próximos eventos. Tá bom? Uma boa tarde para todo mundo. Muito obrigado.